Welcome to a world where even the sweetest, most innocent-looking pets can hide a dark, twisted story. Tonight, we'll dive into tales of horror and fear, true stories from the lives of pet sitters who dared to step into homes where things weren't quite as they seemed. Buckle up, because this first story will leave you double-checking every shadow and strange sound when you're alone. Let's begin. Alyssa was a part-time college student, always juggling jobs to make ends meet. When she came across a pet-sitting job on her town's local classifieds, she was relieved. The pay was more than fair, and the job seemed easy enough. Just a weekend of watching over a dog named Max in a cozy countryside home. Little did she know, this would be a weekend that would haunt her for years. The job was straightforward. The owner, Mrs. Cunningham, an older woman in her 60s, was going out of town for a funeral. She needed Alyssa to stay at the house, feed Max, and just keep an eye on things. A seemingly simple task, but as she read through the messages, one strange thing stood out. Mrs. Cunningham insisted that Alyssa not go into the attic under any circumstances. Curious, but willing to abide by the request, Alyssa shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just storage clutter or maybe a fragile heirloom Mrs. Cunningham wanted to keep safe. However, she would soon learn that the attic held secrets far more sinister. On the day of the job, Alyssa arrived at the house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the quiet, empty road leading to the property. The house stood tall and imposing, a Victorian-style building with dark windows that seemed to peer back at her. A slight chill ran down her spine as she walked up to the door. Inside, she was greeted by Max, a quiet old Labrador with soulful eyes. Alyssa found comfort in his presence, feeling that the dog's quiet loyalty might make the job more pleasant. The interior of the house was as eerie as the outside. Dust-covered furniture, creaky wooden floors, and walls lined with faded family portraits gave the home an unsettling air. But Alyssa chalked it up to the usual old house quirks and went about her duties, feeding Max and getting ready to settle in for the night. As she lay in bed, reading a book to unwind, Alyssa heard something. It was faint, a shuffling sound, almost like footsteps, but coming from above her. The attic. She remembered Mrs. Cunningham's instructions. Do not go into the attic. But curiosity gnawed at her. It's probably just the wind, she whispered to herself, forcing herself to stay in bed, even as the sound continued intermittently throughout the night. Max lay on the floor beside her, his ears perked up, but he remained calm, and she took that as a sign that all was well, or so she hoped. The next day, the strange occurrences began. When Alyssa went into the kitchen to feed Max, she found the pantry door wide open, with several cans knocked over. Frowning, she cleaned it up, wondering if Max had somehow managed to get in there, though it seemed unlikely. As the day went on, Alyssa noticed more unusual things. Objects seemed to move on their own. Small items left in strange places. A music box she hadn't noticed before appeared on the coffee table, though she could have sworn it wasn't there the night before. Dismissing it as her imagination, she continued her duties, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. That night, just as she was drifting off, Alyssa was jolted awake by a soft giggle. It was faint, almost childlike, echoing down from the attic. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay still. Her mind raced with explanations, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the wind or perhaps an old recording from a neighbor's house. Max, who had been lying peacefully, suddenly stood up, his hackles raised, his gaze fixed toward the ceiling. The dog's change in demeanor terrified her even more. Alyssa tried to calm herself, stroking Max's fur as she whispered, "It's nothing, just the wind." But sleep wouldn't come. The house was unnervingly silent. Then, without warning, the footsteps began again, this time louder and more deliberate. And then the sound of something dragging. Unable to ignore it any longer, she grabbed her phone and flashlight, inching her way to the attic door. She knew it was a bad idea, but the sounds were driving her to the edge. As she reached the attic door, Max whined, backing away, something he'd never done before. The attic was musty, filled with boxes and old furniture, but there was something more, a figure. A small, shadowy figure crouched in the corner, unmoving. As her light found its way to the figure, she saw a child, pale hollow-eyed, with a sinister grin. Frozen in place, she stared in horror as the figure let out a low, guttural giggle, the same one she'd heard from her room. In a panic, she bolted down the stairs, Max following close behind. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. The next morning, Mrs. Cunningham called, sounding shocked when Alyssa told her what she'd seen. "The attic," she said in a trembling voice. "That's where my son, he used to play. He died there years ago." Alyssa never returned to that house, and Mrs. Cunningham never contacted her again. But to this day, she remembers that giggle haunting her thoughts, wondering if it was really just her imagination or something far more sinister. This was just the first story. 2 more terrifying pet-sitting tales await. Ready for the next one? The world of pet sitting often sounds mundane, but for some, it can take a twisted, dark turn. In this second story, we meet Carla, a young woman whose experience on a remote farm quickly became a nightmare she would never forget. Ready to hear what happened? Let's begin. Carla had been struggling to pay her bills after her part-time job was unexpectedly cut. So, when she found an ad seeking an experienced pet sitter for a weekend job on a secluded farm, she jumped at the opportunity. The pay was unusually generous for just 2 days, but she wasn't about to complain. The farm was miles away from the nearest town, owned by an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Hampton, who needed someone to watch over their animals while they attended a family emergency. The Hamptons sounded sweet and genuine on the phone, grateful to have found someone last minute. They even offered to leave extra food and some freshly baked goods as a thank you. But before hanging up, Mrs. Hampton's tone became oddly serious. "Stay indoors after dark," Mrs. Hampton said, her voice unsteady. "And if you see any lights in the field, don't follow them." Carla thought it was a strange warning, but brushed it off, assuming it was just an old farmer's superstition. When Carla arrived, the farm was quiet, and the air had an eerie stillness to it. The farmhouse looked like something out of an old postcard, but with a slightly decaying charm. As she walked up to the door, she could see Mr. and Mrs. Hampton rushing to their car, clearly eager to leave before dark. The couple gave her a brief tour, explaining the basic chores, feeding the dogs, looking after a handful of sheep, and locking up the chickens. But before they left, Mrs. Hampton reiterated her warning. "Remember, Carla, don't go outside after dark." Then they were gone, leaving Carla alone on the silent farm. As she looked out over the open land, she felt a pang of unease, a strange sense that she was being watched. But she shrugged it off, trying to remind herself that it was just her nerves in an unfamiliar place. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. As Carla settled in, she tried to enjoy the cozy farmhouse, even though the old pipes and creaky floorboards constantly played tricks on her mind. The farmhouse was drafty, with strange shadows cast by the flickering lights. Then, around midnight, she heard something, a faint scratching sound coming from the back door. Startled, Carla stood up, wondering if it was one of the farm dogs outside. But when she checked, there was nothing there, just an empty porch and the rustling of trees in the wind. Trying to ignore the prickling feeling on the back of her neck, she closed the door, making sure it was securely locked. She told herself it was just a stray animal, or maybe even the wind. But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there. By morning, Carla felt silly for being so scared. The day passed uneventfully as she fed the animals and completed her chores. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon again, an unsettling sense of dread crept back in. That evening, as Carla was cleaning up after dinner, she glanced out the kitchen window and froze. Far out in the field, she saw a faint light bobbing up and down, as though someone were holding a lantern. Remembering Mrs. Hampton's warning, she felt her pulse quicken. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, perhaps a trick of her tired eyes. But the light didn't go away. It drifted closer, weaving through the tall grass, coming nearer to the farmhouse. Unable to resist, Carla moved to the back door and opened it just a crack. The air was cold and still, and the light was brighter now, almost as though it were inviting her to step outside. But then she remembered the warning, "Don't go outside after dark." She shut the door quickly, her heart racing, telling herself it was probably just someone playing a prank. As the hours dragged on, she struggled to sleep, her mind replaying the sight of the light. Then, suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the night. It sounded like it came from the barn. Trying to gather her courage, Carla peeked out the window. The light was gone, but as she squinted into the darkness, she saw something worse. darkness. A shadowy figure, barely visible, standing by the barn, staring directly at the house. Her breath caught in her throat. It didn't look like Mr. Hampton or any worker. This figure was tall and unmoving, almost like a scarecrow. Paralyzed with fear, she watched as it slowly lifted a hand, as if beckoning her to come outside. Panicking, she shut all the curtains, locking every door and window in the house. She retreated to her room, her mind racing. Who was that? And why were they trying to lure her outside? Just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, a soft, steady knock echoed from the front door. Carla's heart pounded as she sat frozen, staring at the door. The knocking continued, calm, methodical, almost patient. Summoning all her courage, Carla approached the door, looking through the peephole. But there was no one there, just darkness. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was trapped, surrounded by miles of empty farmland. Then she heard it, a faint whisper from outside, a voice, distant but clear. "Come on out, it's safe." She felt the blood drain from her face as she realized it was her own voice, calling to her from the darkness. In a blind panic, she grabbed her things and bolted to her car, refusing to look back. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror, and her blood ran cold. The light was back, drifting slowly through the field toward the house, with that shadowy figure watching her leave. The next day, she called the Hamptons, desperate for an explanation. They sounded stunned, claiming they hadn't had any visitors at the farm in years. Mrs. Hampton finally admitted, in a hushed voice, that they had once lost a child in that very field, years ago, under mysterious circumstances. To this day, Carla doesn't know what she saw that night. But one thing is for sure, whatever was out there was calling to her, trying to lure her into the darkness. Please subscribe to this channel, like, share, and I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you. Two pet sitters, two tales of unimaginable horror. But our journey into darkness isn't over yet. Are you ready for the final story? It just might be the scariest one yet. In our final story, we meet Jake, a pet sitter with years of experience, but whose newest client led him down a path he could never have anticipated. Get ready, because this tale of terror will take you to the edge of your seat. Jake had been pet sitting for years, and he thought he'd seen it all. So, when he received an offer to care for a cat named Mr. Mittens over the weekend, he didn't think twice. It was an easy gig with a good paycheck, and the owners seemed nice, if not a bit eccentric. But there was one strange request in their email. Please don't let Mr. Mittens out of the bedroom after sunset, it read. Jake chuckled, assuming it was just an odd habit the owners had developed. After all, he'd had clients who insisted on stranger things. The house was charming in a worn, rustic way, but something about it felt off. As he entered, he noticed how strangely empty it felt. No family photos, no knickknacks, and not a single mirror on the walls. The owners had left him a note on the kitchen counter with specific instructions on how to care for Mr. Mittens. The note ended with the same odd warning. After sunset, keep the door to the bedroom locked and don't let Mr. Mittens out. Jake brushed it off as yet another peculiar superstition and went to check on the cat. The cat was beautiful, sleek black fur and piercing yellow eyes that seemed almost too intelligent. Jake felt a strange chill as he looked at Mr. Mittens, who stared back at him, unblinking. Something about those eyes felt unnatural. That evening, Jake followed the instructions, locking Mr. Mittens in the bedroom as the sun dipped below the horizon. He prepared for bed, chuckling at the absurdity of locking a cat in a room. But as he settled in for the night, he couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard it, a soft, scratching sound coming from the bedroom door. At first, he thought it was Mr. Mittens pawing to be let out, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent, almost frantic. As Jake stood outside the door, he felt a cold draft seeping through the cracks. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, deep sound, a faint whisper coming from the other side of the door. The whisper was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Jake, his skin prickled with fear. He backed away from the door, his mind racing, trying to rationalize what he'd just heard. Maybe he was just overtired, or maybe the house was old and drafty, but he couldn't shake the chill that lingered in the air. The next day, Jake tried to laugh off the strange noises and whispers as a bad dream. He fed Mr. Mittens, who seemed perfectly normal, though his eyes had an unsettling gleam that left Jake feeling uneasy. As he moved about the house, he noticed something odd. Scratch marks covered parts of the walls and doors throughout the house. Some were fresh, others faded as though they'd been there for years. He tried to convince himself it was just Mr. Mittens being restless, but the scratches were everywhere, even in rooms the cat couldn't have reached. Jake's unease grew as he continued his chores. Every so often, he'd feel the cat's eyes on him, watching his every move. And each time he looked back, Mr. Mittens would simply sit there, expressionless, almost like he was studying him. As darkness fell, Jake prepared for bed, but he couldn't shake the gnawing fear that something was terribly wrong. He locked the bedroom door as instructed, but this time he placed a heavy chair in front of it, hoping to keep Mr. Mittens, or whatever else might be in there, at bay. Suddenly, the scratching began again, louder this time, almost violent. Jake sat up in bed, his heart pounding as he heard something else, a soft, eerie laughter coming from the bedroom. It was faint, but unmistakable, like a child's giggle mixed with something far darker. The handle on the door began to rattle, and the shadows under the door seemed to shift and writhe. Jake felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He knew he couldn't stay in the house any longer, but as he grabbed his keys, he heard his name whispered again, only this time it was closer. Jake? It was right next to his ear. Panicked, he turned to see nothing, just the empty, shadow-filled hallway stretching out before him. Desperate to leave, Jake raced to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though some invisible force was holding it shut, trapping him inside. He turned to see Mr. Mittens standing in the hallway, staring at him with those cold, yellow eyes. The cat began to approach him, its eyes glowing in the dim light, and Jake felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine. The air grew heavy, and the faint laughter started again, filling the house with an unnatural, eerie sound. And then, as he looked into the cat's eyes, he saw something terrifying. The eyes weren't just dark, they were like twin voids, pulling him in, filling his mind with a blackness that felt endless. In a burst of adrenaline, Jake broke free, darting past Mr. Mittens, who let out a horrible, shrieking sound, like the cries of something not of this world. He managed to pry the door open and ran into the night, never looking back. To this day, Jake can still hear the whispers in his dreams, calling him back to that house, back to Mr. Mittens. 3 pet-sitting jobs, 3 encounters with unimaginable horror. For some, a side job is just a way to earn extra cash. But for these sitters, it was a glimpse into the unknown.